Yesterday, when we reported on the Umpqua Community College shooting in the relatively immediate aftermath of the shooting, there was very little confirmed hard information about what was going on there. But it's been 24 hours, and now we know quite a bit more about the situation as it developed. 9 people were killed, the shooter as well, a number more wounded. Some reports say 20, some say 25. We know that afterward, in the initial investigation, 13 different weapons were found. At the college, they found 5 pistols, 1 rifle, and 5 magazines of ammunition. And at the residence, an additional 2 pistols, 4 rifles, 1 shotgun, and ammunition. We've also heard that near the rifle on the campus, there was a flak jacket. There had been initial reports he was wearing some form of body armor. Now, as I suspected yesterday, all of the guns were legal, obtained by the shooter or family members. Now, being obtained legally and being transferred to him, whether he got them, stole them, we don't know that. We know that they were initially, by whoever it was that obtained them, obtained legally. And there is some additional information from eyewitnesses at the community college during the shooting. Stacy Boylan, her father, has talked with her, and he says that she said that the shooter said, "I've been waiting to do this for years before shooting the professor." And we initially heard some reports that he had been targeting Christians in some way, and this information is again coming from Stacy Boylan, who told it to her father. She said they would stand up, and he said, "Good, because you're a Christian, you're going to see God in just about 1 second," after asking the question, as we said yesterday, and then he shot and killed them. So from at least one of the witnesses, it does seem that the initial reports that he had some sort of specifically anti-Christian animus or bias does seem to be true. Now, we've got a lot more information, obviously, but it's been 24 hours. We've had time to both learn more and think about it more, and so what are your thoughts?
Good thing we held off yesterday, because there was some information that was wrong yesterday, and there'll be some information today that's wrong. And we'll learn more. The sheriff is not, doesn't appear to be a guy who enjoys sharing information with the press. His stand on not naming the shooter is noble, but yesterday he seemed, that aside, he seemed deliberately hesitant to share information. We still don't know whether the guy was killed by police or whether he killed himself. You know, they used a strange word yesterday. The sheriff did, that he was neutralized. It's funny, I had a really bad vibe from the sheriff yesterday without knowing any of the information we know today, because he said neutralized. And I thought, stop showing off. Like you know. Yeah. And so we'll wait and see. It seems to me that thing about Christians is probably true. Why she wouldn't say it unless it were true, and she's one of the victims. But there are a lot of other reports about who he had a particular animus to, and and his own ethnicity may have entered into that, or it may not. But we'll find out in the coming days. There's no reason we have to know today. We'll know when finally some information starts coming out of Douglas County.
Yeah.
To me, it's another loser with a gun. That's all
that's
it is.
definitely
It's
true,
another loser with a gun. Who cares why they did it? They
Slightly
did it
different flavor, but same basic idea. Yeah.
Because he praised this guy, the most recent loser with a gun, the guy who shot the TV reporter and cameraman in Virginia. This guy specifically wrote, I don't know what, a Facebook post or somewhere wrote about that he was interested in that guy.
Yeah. Yeah, one of those warning signs that people should be looking out for, that
That's
sort
right.
of behavior.
Yeah.
And we know that there was some activities on sites like 4chan and things like that of the same sort. Again, I don't know that that's actually been confirmed to have been him, but those are the sorts of places where if people are going to be looking for these warning signs, that both liberals and conservatives seem to think we should be on the lookout for, because in many cases there seems to be a fairly strong connection between mental problems and violence, although that's not the only thing that apparently drives people to do these sorts of acts. Those are the sorts of things that we need to be on the lookout for. The glorification of violence. And
I just, because you said liberals and conservatives should be looking out for this together, and I agree, and I think they will be. I hope they will be. But you know, I would challenge some conservatives to this. I want these shootings to stop more than I want you to be able to have whatever gun you want. And that is a value. Those are my values, and that's a value judgment that I'm making. And I am certain that there are gun owners and gun lovers out there who feel the same way. And I think it was the president who asked today that some gun owners, and I know there are some who are never going to be reached, but there are plenty who have got to come up and realize this organization that represents gun owners probably does not represent me. Nobody's taking all your guns away. It's just not going to happen. But that we can't begin to take the first steps to a meaningful conversation so that in 3 decades or 4 decades or 5 decades, there's not going to be 320 of these a year. There's going to be a quarter of that. There'll be 75 or 80 of these a year.
We've already had 294 this year.
Right, so I'm assuming we'll have 315 by the end of whatever. You know, the number is astronomically high. And we can have fewer, and there are reasonable steps we can take, and you can love guns and say no to the NRA about some degree of meaningful gun legislation. You're never going to get as far as I'd like to go. I'd like to come get them all. I would. I get it. I lose that argument. But we can start having a reasonable conversation.
It's hard. It's a really complicated issue, not the least complicated because you've already got hundreds of millions of guns out there in circulation that nobody's ever going to turn over. They're all going to work, and they're going to work for
forever,
as long as the person can take care of it and clean it and oil it. And, and
so if I had it, it would like be broken in a year and a half. But other people,
if you're shooting it, if you're not shooting it, it's just sitting there. It's going to be fine for a long, long time.
Yeah,
if you're shooting it, you're not cleaning it. That's the only time you're really going to have a problem.
Yeah, and I mean there's a little bit more in terms of updates and everything. But I'm interested in what you're saying, so I want to turn to it too. I've been thinking a lot about the sorts of laws that you could pass or should pass, and what would actually be effective and what would be acceptable. I would hope that the effective is more important, but we know how seriously people take this. And the people who make the argument that they're needed to stop the government from taking over, I get what you're saying. I think that that's a fantasy. There seems to be a lot of fantasies that, for whatever reason, are correlated with gun ownership. And my father owned many guns. Now, thankfully, he didn't have these sorts of fantasies, but it does seem to be pretty popular. We're going to get to the idea of the good guy with the gun stopping mass shootings, another fantasy that, for some reason, seems to be correlated with gun ownership. But really fast. But there are some regulations that are proposed, or not even regulations, some technological advances in guns that people come up with, and then they try to sell the guns. And the reaction to that tells me that it doesn't have to do with the tyrannical government. Like
you're talking about the smart guns?
Yeah, the smart guns that will only fire for the person who bought it. And the stores get boycotted if they try to sell it.
Well, actually, that gun, I'm not sure it's on the market. I met with the woman who was putting that gun out in the U.S. It's designed by an ex-guy from Glock. And what they had now is a key for it. It wasn't the actual gun itself, which should be on sale this year, but they also sell trigger locks. And there was like hysteria among people because they were selling trigger locks. I mean, I don't know. I don't think I could ever have a gun in the house without a trigger lock when you have kids. I mean, because, you know, mental health things aside, children will pick the stuff up
and do constantly. And if you say that the purpose of the gun is to protect your family, act like it. And make sure that they are not facing more risk from their new protector, the gun, than from the hypothetical thugs and bad people who are going to break into your house and kill them.
The straight-up odds on gun ownership are the most likely person killed by that gun is going to be a member of your family.
Exactly,
Like, there's no question about it.
Yeah, you might hypothetically lower your risk of being killed by brigands breaking into your house, but unfortunately that is far offset by the fact that you're much more likely, you or another member of your family are either going to kill themselves or someone else, either accidentally. You were talking about how you have to frequently clean the gun. Every 3 weeks we get a story of someone shooting themselves or their kid while they're cleaning their gun. They're inherently dangerous, and I think that they need to be treated that way. They're not simply a representation of American freedom and all that is great in America. And in terms of the whole taking it away, look, I think it's impossible, regardless of whether we want to. I think it's impossible to take them all away. There's something like 310 million guns owned by civilians in America. At the very least, that we know of. But you can certainly do a lot, I think. I think that there's a lot that you can do when 40% of all guns are sold private from one individual to another with no background check whatsoever, which means that the whole idea of background checks as a way to stop crazy and dangerous people from getting guns is nullified if you can simply buy it from another individual. I think that doesn't get talked about enough.
Yeah, you know, I was going to say, when you brought up you think it's those who say that it's there to protect us from a tyrannical, overreaching government. Fuck those guys.
I think it also rests on a fairly disrespectful view of the U.S. military.
Yeah, but right, totally. I mean, it's a completely disrespectful view of the U.S. military. And
what do you mean?
That they believe
that they think that the military is going to involve in taking over the country,
I don't think
or that if it was, that they think they could stop it.
Well, I think it's both disrespectful
with their rifle and their shotgun.
I don't think the Army's going to go along with that. This is not. I mean, I love 7 Days in May. It's great. terrific movie.
That
Read it
was a
this week.
great
It's a
movie.
great movie, but that's not happening. But that's a fringe group, and it's peculiar to me that politically, like, we feel the need. I mean, I might have said, you said it this time, but I might have said it too, that we feel the need to somehow maybe cater to people who think they need guns to protect themselves from when the government turns on its own people. I can't be, they're not included in the conversation.
That's a huge percentage of the
Yeah.
people who are interested in gun ownership.
I got it. They're out of the
belief.
conversation. They shouldn't be involved. That's a nutty, crazy thing to believe.
And they're not the ones that we're really trying to reach. We're trying to reach the
Right,
others
and they're unreachable also.
Yeah,
That's right.
there are many, though, who simply believe falsely that they're safer if they have a gun on their person, that they're
Right,
safer
sure.
if they have a gun in their house, and they perhaps can be reached because
And
they're
they're-
not ideologically driven.
and
They're
by the
driven
way,
in terms of
Wes,
fear.
I think if you live way out in the country, I think you are safer.
Yeah,
with
I
a
agree.
gun.
You're going to say there are some people who that's. If
you live out in the country,
and you
you're
are
safer
really
with a gun.
safe about it, then you
Yeah.
probably are safer. Yeah,
But not in suburban America and urban America.
Yeah.
It just doesn't.
Yeah. And the other thing, and this is something that comes up as well, the idea that that's what the purpose of the Second Amendment is. You can make that case. I think that that's one interpretation of the Second Amendment, but I believe it is simply an interpretation. It is not, if you're looking at the literal words, that's not the only interpretation you can have. But also the idea that, well, it's in there, so that's awesome for all time. We should never change it. If you believe that, you do not know what the purpose of an amendment is. The originally written Constitution might have been at the time, and even now, the best political document ever written, or one of the best with the Magna Carta and a couple of others, but it had several inherent fatal flaws. Talk to any African American living in the country more than 150 years ago. It had a lot of flaws that needed to be fixed. It might be that there are still some in there.
It might be.
Yeah, there might have been a couple of mistakes in it. And again, we
Something
have
about money
gun
and politics would
control.
have been
I
nice.
mean, you know, in World War II, the most feared guns were the German 88s. They were gigantic, right? They were dangerous. They shot a long way. They did incredible damage. You're not allowed to own one.
Yeah.
You can't have one. You know, the example used all the time, you can't have a bazooka. It's a gun.
Yeah. Nobody believes that your right to bear arms shall not be infringed in some way.
That's right. It's
Or
just-
the first convicted serial killer in jail who asks to buy an AK-47 and you say no, you're saying implicitly there are some reasons we
Right.
do not give people
we
guns.
have-
We infringe. We infringe in a variety of ways.
we have some gun control. The question is what kind of gun control we're going to have.
Yeah.
And obviously it seems incredibly out. The president said today to the people who say that there should be fewer gun laws and more guns, that's the way to stop this. That's partly the group we're talking about. The president said, come on, nobody really believes that.
And we're getting
I
to the
think
point
people
where
should have to register their weapons.
Yeah.
And I think that weapon registry should be cross-referenced with mental health records for people who present a danger to themselves or society.
Yeah. I love the idea that the solution is more guns. It feels like in a couple more decades, there's not going to be enough American hands to hold all the guns.
Well, it's like saying that it's like people who wanted to fight the drug problem with more drugs. I mean, you know, the problem.
Well, you know what? We've never tried that, though.
Let's have more cocaine.
Yeah.
That's what we need.
So before we turn to the politicians' statements about the shooting, there was one area. So we mentioned the sheriff. I hope that he does everything he needs to do in terms of the investigation, finding out everything we can about what happened at UCC. But he did send a letter to Vice President Biden not too long ago, and we've cut out a few sections to give you an idea of perhaps some biases that he might be holding as he goes into this investigation. He said, in part in the letter, this letter serves two purposes. First, to make a formal request that you not tamper with or attempt to amend the Second Amendment. Gun control is not the answer to preventing heinous crimes like school shootings. I think that's debatable. The United States Supreme Court has ruled when a sheriff chooses to enforce an unconstitutional directive, he is violating his constitutional oath. I will not violate my constitutional oath, nor will I permit the enforcement of any unconstitutional regulations or orders by federal officers within the borders of Douglas County, Oregon. In conclusion, it is my position as Sheriff of Douglas County, Oregon, that I will refuse to participate in nor tolerate enforcement actions against citizens that are deemed unconstitutional. I can only imagine when he says he will not permit the enforcement by federal officers, what exactly he will use to enforce that.
And
I assume violence.
And who's deeming it constitutional or not? Does that mean?
Oh, no, that's what I love about the last
it's okay.
part.
He'll be like, all right.
Yeah. No, he means himself.
Yes.
That's
He
what
means
He's gonna.
Exactly. I'm glad that you saw that too.
He's determined.
That jumped out.
The Constitution is determined to change for determining the constitutionality of it, but he doesn't care.
Yeah. Exactly. And again, we know very little about him. Maybe this experience.
I know enough about him. I know guys like this. I covered guys like this. I've read this. This guy is an oath keeper. This is a guy who allies himself with Clive and Bundy. This is a guy who would ally himself with Kim Davis. I don't know what his position on gay marriage is, but I can take a guess. But mostly, what I find, and I don't know everything about him. I don't. And so some of the hate will come, and I embrace it.
Mm-hmm. There's going to be a lot of hate.
He wrote Vice President Biden.
Yeah.
He doesn't think Barack Obama is his president. That's why he did that.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
I would
even occur to me.
I will bet the confusing expression "dollars to donuts" that this guy thinks that, especially early 2013, before his second inauguration, not his president. Biden, that guy, he's the vice president.
Yeah.
He's close enough.
No significant differences between the two.
I don't know. Maybe he didn't have the president's address.
Or maybe he feels like Biden's more likely to read fan letters.
So part of this is also like, because the majority of police officers, you know better, Wes. But
I'm not a cop, dude.
No,
I was an Army officer.
No, I know, but you know better.
We don't know the difference.
Right, exactly. But I suspect you know more cops. I suspect some guys you serve with probably became cops.
No, I know guys who are cops.
So most police officers are in favor of some form of gun control because they don't want guys having guns. They like it when there's no gun in the house when they go into the house.
Yeah.
So there are some who are like John Hanlon who want less gun control, but they're in the minority, police officers. So let's say that first. I don't think we should be electing sheriffs in this country. I never have. As Wes and I were talking right before the show, sheriffs, judges, like these are not the job of a sheriff. This is not he's not the mayor. This is a professional job for professional law enforcement officers. Yeah. And he may be one. He may have been a professional law enforcement officer. Again, I don't know enough about this guy. But in general, this is not a position where you ought to be campaigning. If you're the chief law enforcement officer of a town,
no, and that's a campaign letter that he wrote.
This is a campaign letter. This is a campaign letter, and it's wrong for a sheriff, for a chief law enforcement officer of Douglas County to be involved in this kind of nonsense. And if you want that, you should write the president, because Barack Obama is your president.